And welcome to this episode. My name is Albek. I am a professional video and photojournalist, and I teach workshops about street photography. In this episode we will talk about camera settings and the approach to street photography in the night. First of all, let's dig into what street photography in the night is. It is a bit different from shooting in pure daylight, where you have all the light you need. You have a busy street, a lot of people in activity. In the night, the mood changes and people will act a little bit differently. It will be different situations where people are maybe standing outside a cafe, they will be sitting on a restaurant. They will have their day off and they will not be as busy. It will be a different mood than in the daytime, where everybody is in a hurry going to and from their job or whatever they are doing. The mood is of course also very different because the light is different, and you will have to seek different areas to approach to make a scenery where there is life if you like to use people in your photos. If you are more into scenes where people are at a distance, you will have to approach it like watching buildings with good light. It can be a tram in the middle of the street, it can be city lights from cars running by. But if you're into street photography with people as the main focus, you will have to search restaurants and areas with that kind of activity. If we first look at the camera we can use for street photography in the night, it will be almost the same camera I will recommend you to use at normal street photography. This will be a small camera like the Leica M9 here, or Leica M10 and 11, at least small cameras. It can also be the Sony Alpha system, it can be Fuji X100V, whatever brand or camera you prefer. But use a small camera that is light, and especially one that is good to shoot in low light. That means that it have a fast lens that will be an aperture from at least 2.8 and below, so as you get as much light into the sensor as possible, so you do not need to put the ISO setting so high that you add a lot of noise to your picture. The Leica M9 is not famous for produce nice pictures as soon as you push the ISO above 800, but I rarely do that anyway, because the Leica Summilux 50mm lens, which is my favorite lens, is having an aperture stop down to 1.4. That means it lets a lot of light in. As soon as you get up to like an aperture of 2 and above, you will get less light. I have to push the ISO setting higher. This adds more noise. Modern cameras today, of course, are really good at producing really nice noiseless pictures, even at very high ISO settings. I rarely shoot anything with an ISO settings above 800 because I set my aperture at 1.4 with this lens. You have to adapt that to the lens you have, of course, and I put my shutter speed at 50 or 60 depending on the situation. When searching for light in the evening, you have to find places with natural, or it's actually artificial light, because it comes from window stores, the light bulbs from a restaurant, it can be the street lights, it can be lights from cars running by, whatever kind of light that influences into the area, quite different from the sun. The sun is on a cloudy day, it has a cooler temperature of light. Everything in the night when the sun is down will be very warm tones from the artificial light bulbs placed around the scenery. The biggest challenge for color photographs in the night is that every light bulb might have a different color, and it can vary from very blue cool tones over to warm temperatures but with a green cast or a yellow cast, and it can be difficult for your eye to predict if it is one or the other, because our eyes are really good at adapting both the intensity and the colors of the light. With a little training, you will be able to watch different light bulbs and compare them even with your eye, but the camera is really sensitive to what light source is available, and you will get both green and yellow and red stitches, magenta stitches, into your picture if you do not set your white balance properly. For street photography, I will not recommend running around with a white balance card all the time, setting it up, measuring the light, because it will change whenever you just walk 3 feet away and you get a different light source. It can change completely the color tone. So use your auto white balance, shoot what I recommend in the raw setting, so you have a lot of adjustment possibilities afterwards in your post-processing. I know that JPEG files are smaller, they will not fill up so much space on your computer, on your hard disk, but you get a lot of information with raw files and can edit them and tweak them so they'll look natural and pleasing afterwards. If you shoot black and white, it will be a smaller problem, but still you will be able to adjust skin tones and the mood of the scene when you begin to use the slider just on the natural white balance slider between cool and warm tones. Will change the scenery. You will see that as soon as you begin to work with it in Lightroom or Photoshop, whatever program you use for post-production. When I approach a scene and want to make a correct exposure, I have to look at the scene where the light source comes from and then make a test shot or two to see if I hit the right exposure before I actually begin to shoot. Because if you use the automatic measurement in your camera, no matter if it is a wide area or a center weighted measurement of the light, you will make the camera guess what light there is in the picture. And if you have a person lit just a little aside of the frame and everything else around that person or image focus point is pure black, then the camera will be forced to try to measure something in between, and will maybe take the dark areas, try to push them up, and the person will be overlit, or the scenery will be overlit where the light actually is. Or the opposite can happen if you have a really strong light source lighting up a larger piece of the area, then the camera will try to push the exposure down and try to adjust that, and you might underexpose your picture. So what I do is I look at the scenery. If I have a person anywhere or I have a light source nearby, I take my hand, I measure the light on my hand, adjust my camera a little, take a test picture of the scene, look at my screen. If it is overexposed, I stop it down 1 or 2 stops, depending on how far away I have hit from the best exposure. Take a new picture, just look at the screen and say, okay, this is it. And it's better to underexposure just slightly, because it's better to push up the gray tones and the darks instead of trying to bring down what was overexposed on digital cameras, because digital cameras are not that good at preserving what is overexposed. They are better at preserving what is underexposure. So always underexposure your pictures a little if you are in doubt about the perfect exposure. But letting the camera guess with light sources only lighting up bits and pieces in a night picture will be a big demand of the camera, and you will rarely hit the right exposure. So manual exposure is the thing. I set my camera lens wide open at 1.4 in this example with a Leica M9 here. Then I set my ISO settings around 800, that's the maximum, and then I can adjust with the shutter speed, because at the Leica M9 I have to go into the menu to adjust the ISO settings. On the Leica M10 and 11 you can use the wheel on top of the camera with the ISO settings and use that to push your exposure up and down and make the right exposure. And I recommend use the aperture settings fixed, the shutter speed more or less fixed, and then use the ISO settings to put in more or less light into the sensor. But you can also use the shutter speed and have a fixed ISO setting. Depends on what your preference will be in that situation. Using a camera that is light sensitive and have a fast lens will make you able to hold your camera still, capture the image without it being blurred, because of you are not able to hold the camera still. So a good position is to have your arms to your body, the camera up for your eye, and support it well. Using a rangefinder camera makes it easier for you to frame and focus when it's dark. The EVF camera, the electronic viewfinder camera here, has a tendency to try to compensate for the low light and push up the image that you're viewing in the lens, and that makes it difficult to set the right focus point. Also, the automatic focusing system will often fail in low light, where you need manual focus to set your focus point right, and that will be helped a lot by the rangefinder system. The majority of night street photography will be handheld. You will not have a tripod at hand unless you are capturing larger scenes where you use a slower shutter speed and accept things are blurring out because they are moving and you are shooting at a low shutter speed. But most will be handheld if you are doing actions and try to follow people and what's happening in the night. Using a camera with a full frame sensor is also a good advice, because full frame sensors takes up more light and they will produce less noise even when the ISO settings are pushed really up. You will have to shoot with your lens wide open so you can have a decent shutter speed and the ISO settings as low as possible. Therefore, your approach to the scenery will be different from if you like to shoot with a really rich depth of field in the daytime. Here you have to accept that you have very little depth of field, but instead you will be able to capture things happening in the night. Else you will have to push your ISO settings really high and add some noise into your picture if you want to stop your lens down so it gets a richer depth of field. So it's always a trade-off from one thing or another, and you will have to find the balance depending on the situation and think about how your image will look, because you have those demanded settings to be able to shoot at night, which is more challenging than shooting on a bright clear day in the daytime. You can approach the night scenery in different ways. You can either look for a scenery that is lit up by the light surrounding it, or you can find a darker street where there's light in the background and use that to bring out the silhouettes. It can be reflective lights in the windows, it can be moving cars, it can be all kinds of situations, and you have to find your own way to predict what will happen and how you will approach the scenery. One of the advantages of shooting in a lit situation from light bulbs in the street in the night is that you can use those lights to bring forward the person or the image, whatever you want to bring forward, and put everything in the background because it will disappear in the dark. So when you approach the scenery, think about where the light hits, wait for the people to walk by and being lit up by the light, press your shutter button, and then you have the picture in that exact space, and you can set your focus point up front at that spot where the light hits and wait for people to approach. You can also walk around the street and find different situations where you have colorful signs. It can be in front of a cinema where people are waiting in line, and you will have probably some light from the surface of the cinema that will lit up people. So there are a wealth of opportunities to seek inspiration in the night scenery and capture beautiful moments. It just doesn't have to be bright daylight to make a good photo. The only thing I avoid at any time when I am photographing is using a flash, and also not in the night, because I think a flashlight is artificial. It just brings some artificial feeling to the scenery, and I know there are people loving the flashlight and it will lit up the scenery, but it will also kill the natural feeling of the scenery, I find. But go out, experiment, find your own way of doing it, and especially work on the exposure, because that's the most tricky thing in night photography, is to hit the right exposure, especially when you have light sources coming maybe just from one source. So move around the scenery, try to find new angles and find where the light hits people or your subject best possible. As with anything else in street photography, a small camera body and small lenses is essential. The choice of lens is really important. So having a fast lens, you can shoot wide open and still have a sharp image, is essential. And the Leica lenses are really good. They will have a crisp and clear, sharp image from the edges into the center of the rear. A 35 or 50 millimeter lens will be appropriate for shooting in the night, because those lenses also are the fastest lenses. As soon as you use a tele lens, 85 or 100 millimeter, you often will see that the aperture will not go further down than 2.8, and as soon as you use a zoom lens, you will not go lower than 4.5, 5.6 in aperture, and this means you will have to push the ISO settings more and add more noise to the image. Noise can be beautiful in some images, it can also be too much, but what I will not do is recommend that you begin to remove noise a lot in the post-production, because it will make the image look artificial. In my mind, I think it's important to make it as natural and authentic as possible when we are working with street photography. I prefer keeping AI out of my camera and out of my post-production as much as possible, but that will be a topic for a little later. The new cameras are really good at shooting in low light with high ISO settings and still produce nice images with low noise and preserve colors. The M9 here is, as soon as it is above the 800 ISO, will begin to produce artificial and off colors and more noise than will look pleasing for an image, I think. But the modern cameras will be capable of doing that. So a small trick to measure light with your camera is to put your hand up, and my skin tone is probably really boring gray tone like, so I can use my hand and put it up to the light, and the angle I put it up to the light determines how much it will reflect. But if I put it into the source, adjust my camera settings to that, take a picture or two, adjusting a little up and down, then I will have a decent exposure for that scenery I'm around. But it will change as soon as you move a little away from the light or more into the light, or at least that your subject move into the light or away from the light. The light drops really rapidly in strength as soon as you go further away from the light source. But try, experiment, walk around the city, find interesting scenes, especially in wintertime when we have Christmas and New Year's Eve. You can have interesting active photos in the night, but also a summer days out where people are standing around cafes, walking up and down the streets, having a good relaxing time compared to the busy time in the day life where everybody are hurrying forth and back from their job. It will be a different mood, a different experience in the night.